This exhibition is really about celebrating iconic houses in Australia. So we've worked with the original material from My Iconic Houses books, but then we've configured it in quite a different way to make different points so that people really understand what was groundbreaking about these different projects. Well, the original inspiration came from the fact that I live in a Bruce Rickard house, and I was on maternity leave when you have a bit of time to kind of think about things in between feeding and changing nappies and so forth. And I thought, well, if this house exists, maybe others also exist. And a friend of mine, the photographer Michael Wee, who did all the photography for the books, he mentioned to me that Murdoch Books were looking for projects, and so we sort of turned it into a bit of a proposal, never ever expecting that anything would happen. And so when it did, we were a bit shocked, and I thought, oh, I'm going to actually have to find all these houses now. For me, iconic was about having the right architect who had a great body of work of which I could then photograph an example. But the house had to break some new ground. It had to be a different way of living for that time, whether it was something lightweight in Queensland or something monumental in Victoria. It had to feel like it moved the language of architecture on somewhat. It's an interesting process, A, what is iconic, and B, what you can actually find and photograph, because all the houses in the book were photographed in 2006 for the first book and 2010 for the second book. And so it's one thing to find a house, it's another thing to be able to get access to it, for it to have the right furniture and to be able to then photograph it and write about it. So in some senses, I didn't find the houses found me. And I did start always with the point of view of who is the right architect. And from the architect then tried to source a house, because it's important. You can have a great house from someone who's just had a one-off, and I didn't want it to be that. I wanted it to be architects that were really shaping kind of groundbreaking domestic spaces in Australia at their respective times. It's funny where you start off with a project and where you end up. So I started off as a researcher, you know, trying to find houses that suited my purposes. And as you're drawn into the project, and as you meet people, and as you interview architects, and you learn more about their whole career, their genre, their body of work, you actually do become you know, quite passionate about them all. And so I think the opportunity to do an exhibition takes that a layer further. So now that I'm, you know, 8 years on, my relationship and my understanding and appreciation of their work has only but increased, and that's why it's exciting through video interviews to capture a lot of what these people say, and for their philosophies to come alive. Diversity, I think, has come about as a byproduct of tuning into interesting architects and hence tuning into interesting work. And so you find all sorts of different approaches dependent on climate often. You know, you have that sort of Gabriel Poole's very lightweight, calibrated footings to work with steep sites in Queensland. And then in Melbourne and in Victoria, you have these very massed geometric houses in concrete that are very grounded and anchored. So the diversity kind of came through finding talented architects and how they express themselves in their work. You know, actually looking at a picture in a book when you're researching and then going to visit something is an entirely different experience, and it's a very intimate one because you're drawn into this house that is a three-dimensional expression of someone's work and life. And so it was actually, and once you talked to the architects and understood how the house manifested their philosophy and their opinions and their ideas, it became even more a kind of emotional connection as well. I think it's very important to see houses in the flesh, because often pictures can leave out as much as they include, and you mightn't, it might look like it's quite isolated, but actually it's in a suburban context or whatever. So the experience of visiting and being in them was very important for me to be able to write about them properly. The one I think that I found really exciting was the Hugh Buick house, because I'd seen it in magazines when I lived in London in the 90s, and it was one of those houses that just stayed with me in the back of my mind somewhere. And so actually to try and find it through this rather modest, you know, low garden and come across this incredible gem of a house was remarkable. But having said that, all of the houses hold something of that power. Well, the Marshall House was for us such a tremendous find, because I knew nothing about, while I was working in the kind of magazine lifestyle sector where we did feature a lot of houses and interiors and so forth, I didn't have an understanding of Australian architecture. So my reaction to this house was intuitive rather than from a point of, oh, it's a Bruce Rickard house. A friend had shown me pictures and we came on the first open day. So it was actually, which I think is a good thing, the response was immediate and intuitive rather than intellectual. I think what is most distinctive about the house is that there's no front door. So it's a kind of wall of doors, glazed, all to the north, because Bruce Rickard was all about orientation for light, and so he was determined that you would get maximum winter sunlight. And so you come down quite a steep hill and then you turn into this very open, friendly face of the house, which is a courtyard that faces north, that gets the sun. And then it's a very open space. So the planning is, living, dining and kitchen. And he's clever. He doesn't want the kitchen. He always said, I don't want the mess of a kitchen to be exposed. So it's actually hidden behind the brick, which is kitchen on one side and the fireplace on the other. So it's one very simple solution to those two issues. And then you go through to a deck, and that's where you see the view. So there is a sandstock brick wall because the house faces west, so that then it doesn't get too hot. So when I was there on the open day, people were saying, oh, well, obviously you would knock this wall through. And what people don't realise is that then you would need air conditioning to counteract the heat from the westerly sun and so forth. So this house isn't air conditioned, it's all about through breezes. And then downstairs, that's the bedroom level. And the bedrooms are sort of quite cabin-like, kind of functional. But Bruce is wonderful at building in furniture. So actually you don't need a lot of things so moving in was very simple. The lights are in, shelvings here. So lots of things existed. So it's a kind of painless house to move into. It's interesting when you live in a house. Before I'd spoken to Bruce, and before, as I worked on this architectural project, I actually appreciated him more, because I could kind of begin to see the layers of things that he'd done, and often they're very simple and quite economical. So above the beds there is a timber shelf, and underneath there are 2 light bulbs that you screw in, and that's your reading light. So he's been very interesting with how he's dealt with light even in a big continuous space like this one, because different switches control different light. So you just have pools of light. It doesn't need to be lit in a blanket fashion all the time. So there are those subtleties. I mean, people say that all the switches are very low, as though for dwarfs or small children. So that's an interesting quirk. People go to the bathroom and they can't find the switch because it's quite low down. But all of the things in the house are there for a reason. There isn't any indulgence. They're there to look beautiful or to actually be functional. Well, Bruce never liked talking when he was asked to speak, so he'd always get his clients to come in, and he felt that was a more genuine expression. He'd get them to speak for him. So I got to know him through that, and it made me then think about the attributes of the house. Why did I like living here? What were the things that actually affected day-to-day life? And so he was quite clever that way. He's was a very modest man, but a very intelligent man. And we would go on these house tours to see other Rickard houses. So we met other kind of Rickard buffs on these, these little tours of the northern beaches, which was fascinating too. Well, the children, as they grew up, became very conscious that it was a very particular house, and they'd go to their friends and they'd come back and go, why can't we have a sort of 60-inch TV screen, and why don't we have a swimming pool? And then as they began to get older, they became quite protective of it, and they really understand it, and I think they're very proud of it. And what Bruce is very clever at is that connection with nature. So, you know, the sky and the changing skies are very much a part of daily life. And the children will go, Mum, this is a lovely sky. Do you think it's good enough to Instagram? You know, they understand that there is beauty in that observation. And I think that's quite a powerful thing, actually, to pass on to your children. It's an interesting question, because I love this house, and I would like it to always be here. And I'm not a person that thinks ahead too much. What's interesting is that the people before us had 3 boys, so it's a robust house. You know, people have grown up in it, and we have been here now for nearly 14 years, so people stay a long time. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the future. I can see someone else coming in and putting their own things in, and I like that, actually. I like the idea that it has a, you know, continued appreciation and use, but it's very hard to control those things after you've gone. It was interesting revisiting these houses, you know, often decades after they were built, so that they'd have plenty of time to develop a patina and character all of their own. And there is this wonderful quote from Rick Lapastria that houses aren't at their best when just built, that it is kind of with love and time that they become more beautiful. And I see that time and time again in the houses that I've visited, especially if they've been with the original owner. And they often get to these houses people who love them, and they're not the original owner. And not many have passed through too many hands. And I think that's part of the secret to that kind of development is the care that people take with these places. They know they're special, and they're very sensitive to how they live in them.